fine introduction. Friends, as we will be talking in next 10 days about the idea of science diplomacy, both my colleagues, Ambassador Bhaskar Balakrishnan and Dr. Ravi Srinivas will be talking to you specifics of science diplomacy, how it works, what are the nuances, what are the issues that are there. I thought I would talk to you right on first day in the first session on why we are together, what brings us together, and what is the rationale for our cooperation. And that I think is extremely important for us to grasp in the beginning, because there is a context to our cooperation and all of you coming here. As you know, you are here as part of the program called ITEC, ITEC, and while you have signed the program, sort of applications, etc., you might have seen this ITEC, which is Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program. ITEC program was launched in 1964. But this was not the beginning of India's bilateral development cooperation. Actually, India's program for bilateral cooperation started in 1946, when India was not even independent. And there was a proposal in India to bring in some scientists for training in agriculture in 1946, and the government was still led by Britishers. India was a colony of the Britain. So British government refused sanctioning this training program as proposed in India by the first Prime Minister-elect of India. But they prevailed, and they invited 25 scientists from China and 25 scientists from Indonesia. And they, in 1946, these were the two countries that were invited in September 1946 for a training program in India, and that was the beginning of India's development cooperation as India became independent in 1947. Right in 1949, India announced 75 fellowships for developing countries to come and visit in India. So this was, in a way, beginning of the ITEC program. It was named as ITEC only in 1964, but actually it started in 1946. And there's a very rich history of India's development cooperation. I have several slides, but I have only around 40 minutes, so I would be very quick, but I would very much like my colleagues to later share the PowerPoint with you on your emails, and also if anybody requires hard copy, there's hard copy also available. I hope my colleagues have also shared with you the output of the previous participants of the course. So ITEC course participants have been contributing at least one paper, either individually or collectively. We encourage everyone to contribute individually, so that whatever you are absorbing, we know what you are writing. And if you have any constraint or limitation of English language, please do not bother. 4 of them are here to do the necessary hand holding. So we have 8 hands to do this for you. So if you are constrained, please just explain your idea. Please just explain your national policy or approach on science, on development, on South-South cooperation, anything that you feel like. Today, this morning, Dr. Mitra talked to you about several global initiatives. He talked to you about International Solar Alliance. He talked to you about Antarctica Mission. Dr. Balakrishnan would also talk about some of these initiatives. So it's perfectly fine. You can pick up anything that you feel like, or you're already working on in your own country, and you think your own country's experience is also very important. Friends, the beauty of the South-South cooperation is that it is not delivered by only big countries like China, India, etc. It is done by smallest of small countries as well. There are several papers by our ITEC participants who have written out how smallest of small countries are actually doing some of the biggest programs in cooperation. Colombia is one which is leading some of the human resource development programs. Cuba is one which is actually delivering global health initiatives all across. Tanzania is one which, led by at some point by Julius Nyerere, delivered huge impetus to the idea of South-South cooperation. Argentina hosted several of the recent meetings of the global importance, and all of us were in Buenos Aires when Buenos Aires plan for South-South cooperation celebrated its 40th anniversary, and most of us were in Buenos Aires last March when Papa Plus 40 was celebrated all across. So some of us are very closely linked with the evolution of South-South cooperation. And what exactly do we mean by South-South cooperation? What are the nuances of South-South cooperation and why it is important is something that I have captured in my slides. We are also going to talk to you when science diplomacy is in action in next few days with you. There are also plans that both Dr. Ravi and Dr. Bhaskar Balakrishnan will talk to you about your weekend trips to different places. And Nimita will tell you how evenings you can spend here enjoying some dance and drama and cultural programs that are also a beauty of this course that we are holding it in India Habitat Center. India Habitat Center is one of the most vibrant cultural centers of Delhi. So it has an office complex on this side. The other side of the complex is the convention center, where you see the lotus pond and everything. Every evening there are a lot of dance, drama, musical programs. So you can see them. Maybe you can give them a list of events for next 10 days. And there is India International Center, which is also pretty close. There also there are several programs. So Nimita would share all the details with you, and it would be easy for us to organize your trips. And this building is a beautiful example of public-private partnership. The land is owned by government, but it is run by private sector. So you would see the difference. And your hotel is completely government hotel. So you can see the difference between the two, and as you move forward, you would realize it. So, but we are here to help you. Kindly let me know if you have any constraint, whether in your hotel or here or anything else that you need. I will quickly start my lecture. I would have only half an hour now. So the idea, friend, is in terms of the classification. What is South-South cooperation? How we actually talk about it in terms of connecting with various actors, and in what way we think that South-South cooperation can really deliver what is required. So after Second World War, when the reconstruction process started, we started working in terms of identifying the possibilities of cooperation, trying to see as the Cold War unfolded, the idea of West and East got some significance. But those who aligned themselves with the non-aligned movement, and there were many countries which were part of that non-aligned, which preferred to be sort of bracketed in form of the South. And that's where the idea of South-South cooperation emerged. It had, of course, several facets and several dimensions of its engagement, and you would see what kind of dimensions are important in terms of UNCTAD, in terms of G77, and that's where the idea of South-South cooperation came forward, because for Europe after the Second World War, the Marshall Plan came up, and Marshall Plan gave the necessary impetus to the reconstruction in Germany and in other places. But for developing countries, no Marshall Plan came up, and we could not get the UN resources. So the idea was, and there were a lot of negotiations for almost a decade before the idea of 0.7% of the GNP that the ODA should give. And as you know, even last November, the report that was released by OECD DAC is very clear that only now 7 countries are following the commitment of 0.7%. So there is a huge deficit which is continuing in terms of the idea of its delivery. And this largely is in terms of where the dimensions of cooperation are there. Though in the late 80s and early 90s, with the structural adjustment program of the World Bank, with the Washington Consensus, the idea of South-South cooperation actually declined. And it declined to an extent that resurrection was very difficult unless the Uruguay round was over in 1995 and the GATT was replaced with the World Trade Organization, WTO, which actually triggered in a huge reaction by developing countries. And this reaction was in such a manner that the developing countries in Brazil in a way asserted in 2003 at the Cancun WTO ministerial for resurrection of the South. And that's where the idea of the India, Brazil, South Africa partnership came up. So IPSA or IBAS as it is called in Brazil, that came up. And this grouping then became nucleus for G20, which was within WTO. So there are 2 G20s, one G20 which we know for global financial architecture, but there was another G20 which came up of the developing countries led by Brazil, South Africa, India, within the WTO. And this G20 group played a very important role in trade negotiations. So all that was largely part of this resurrection of the South. And this was also the time economies were growing and growing at 7%, 8%, China at 11%. So the whole of late 90s from 1995 to 2005, a huge jump in economic growth across all countries, and this was largely in terms of how things were going. But if you go in the history, you find that South-South cooperation was not new in terms of fund-based financing. There's a beautiful paper by Jagdish Bhagwati in 1986 where he has identified various parameters, and they have identified how the idea of the fund and opaque countries were the first set of countries which actually established a fund to support South-South cooperation. So this is the first account in our history of South-South cooperation as to how world can really move in terms of contributing to the idea that Bhagwati captured in terms of structural and efficient delivery on South-South cooperation. The idea of the opaque fund was largely sort of countered when the Washington Consensus came up, and there was some watering down within OPEC because then the United States started influencing Saudi Arabia's policy on OPEC funds. So it was going a bit slow. But it is also important for you here to understand that there are some important distinctions between South-South and North-South cooperation. And this is not to say that we do not want to work with North, but it is just to realize why they are different. And those of you who are going to deal with South-South cooperation or with science diplomacy, it is important to have somewhere in your mind this little information that how at theoretical level the two are different. I do not know how many of you have background in economics, but I think it is important for us to realize that in economic literature, after the Second World War, a huge debate which was extremely polarized continued. There was a debate among some economists who largely identified themselves with Chicago School of Economics and were actually part of what is called as the monetarist theory in economics. So monetarist theory is that monetary variables and for that matter macroeconomic variables are extremely important if economic growth has to happen. So the global economy can function most efficiently if macroeconomic variables are in shape. So how much should be the balance of payment gap? What should be the level of inflation? How much foreign exchange reserve we should have? All these variables, which are actually macroeconomic variables, they should be in shape. So there are defined ranges, like for instance, the budget deficit should not be more than 3.5%. If it is more than 3.5%, you are likely to have disaster in your economy. So there were several people who came up with this idea that economy should be in some framework which is important. There was another group which was saying that economic growth can happen even if macroeconomic variables are not in shape. Even if there is disequilibrium in the economy, economic growth can still happen. This is just the information that I wanted to leave. Now, there are certain lexicon that has been sort of attached with this. So there is a bit of academics there. These are two sort of perspectives. One is called as endowment perspective, and the other is called as evolutionary perspective. Just to simplify, endowment perspective is basically the framework. So the macroeconomic variable should be in one shape, is a framework approach, or is called endowment approach. And this is the approach which actually emanated out of the monetarist school. So this is associated with monetarist school, and this is associated with structuralist school. The structuralist school was led by Rolf Travis. In RIS, you would find one room now dedicated to Rolf Travis. And Rolf Travis was from country that we love most in South, Argentina, and he led the sort of establishment of UNCTAD. He led the establishment of the theoretical basis of South-South cooperation. So this structuralist school is also called as evolutionary school. So according to them, evolution can happen, the economic growth can happen as economy is evolving. So with evolution, you gain strength. That's the idea. The economy gets the strength, it gets the heft that is required for us to jump higher. It can happen as we are restructuring. Because after the Second World War, quite a few countries were still colonized. So how that sort of trouble of colonization be overcome, the constraints of colonization be overcome, there were several prescriptions coming to us. But Rolf Travis, Samir Amin from Egypt, they all theorized and gave to us what we call as evolutionary perspective. This is also called as capacity building. So the point that I was telling you, that India started developing human resources right in 1946, was largely because India thought that if human resources do not have capacity, if we do not have trained engineers, trained doctors, paramedics, economy cannot function. And this is what now we are talking again about Industrial Revolution 4.0, which is talking about skills. This is nothing but what we have been saying right from 50s and 60s, that there is need for capacity building. Now, what is capability and what is capacity? What is meant by capability building and what is meant by capacity building? There's a beautiful chapter that a colleague of ours has written. The book is there in RIS library, where they have drawn from Amartya Sen's writing on how world started the Human Development Report. That's another issue. I will talk to you at some point on that. But this is largely the distinction that I wanted to draw between endowment and an evolutionary perspective. In fact, the beautiful commentary on this is written by one Japanese economist, Yagunihara. So those of you who are interested, the book is in our library, and you can photocopy the chapter or the contents of the book. So that Yagunihara was the first author who devised this distinction, and Won Lim, who is with the Korean Development Institute (KDI) in Seoul. He's now at Johns Hopkins University for his sabbatical. He is the one who wrote out the capacity building and the liberalization framework. Because what happened was that those who said that macroeconomic variables should be in shape actually were supported by the World Bank and IMF. So they said that if economies are not functioning the way a macroeconomic variable should function, loans would not be given to them, or grants would not be given to them. And that is what is called as Washington Consensus. And Washington Consensus actually came up with conditionalities, that if you have to accept loan from World Bank, or if you want grants from the OECD-backed donors, you have to behave in certain manner. Your policy should be of certain type. And that was the Washington Consensus. Washington Consensus made strictures, past strictures against countries that were not following. Latin America wipeout of 70s was largely because of this. Latin America was doing very well in the early 60s, but whole 60s and 70s, the way World Bank and IMF enforced the World Bank IMF SAP program, it really wiped out the comparative advantage of the whole Latin American countries. They went through huge turmoil in the financial market. In fact, there are several volumes on financialization of the economies of the Latin American countries. So one other distinction between North-South and South-South is that those who believe in endowment perspective or in the framework approach actually believe in conditionality of grants. Those who believe in evolutionary perspective or ingredient approach, as it is called, have no faith in conditionality, because they believe that economic growth can happen even if economy is in disequilibrium. But they say that no, framework is the thing to be followed, and those who are not in shape, those economies which are not in shape, need not be assisted in any way. And this is where conditionality element of the economies that followed this philosophy came in. So there is a philosophical and practical difference between North-South and South-South cooperation. And this is something which we need to understand as we are all sitting down for science diplomacy. We need to see what role science plays there. I will come on that. And then we are also bringing in the idea that is needed for us to go forward. Now, what we are saying is that South-South cooperation works on certain principles. And what are those principles? Co-development, compact, co-development. So what are the essential principles and what are the modalities? So as I told you, modalities are many. One is capacity building, the in-house training program. So as all of you are here from different countries, you are here as part of the training program. There may be technology transfer, financial assistance, lines of credit, humanitarian assistance. These are different modalities within which South-South cooperation can happen. We would come back on that a little later. But the essential principles are respect for national sovereignty, national ownership, independence, equality, non-conditionality, non-interference, mutual benefit, demand-driven nature. So these are the 8 principles on which South-South cooperation is based, and these are the modalities on which they are based. So how these modalities can be understood is something that we have tried to explain to you. South-South cooperation cannot be understood at a macro level. South-South cooperation works best at agriculture, in industry, in manufacturing. It can work best in the capacity building, but it cannot be like North-South, a macro program. So it is important that we have sectoral approach to understand South-South cooperation. We need to see, I would just quickly run now on ITEC program. I have already given you the broad context, but as of now, every year India is getting 12,000 people under the ITEC program, and there are 247 courses that are being offered by 112 institutions in this country. They are the ones who are hosting these programs, and they are providing the support. The program has evolved, and those of you who are further interested in India's development cooperation, this chart I have borrowed from my book, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. We called it Logic of Sharing. So what is the logic behind when India is sharing India's development partnership with others? So that logic of sharing explains, because very often we are asked, India has so many poor, why still India is giving to others? So what is that logic which is driving us to give assistance to? This is the evolution, and again, let me remind you of the point that I mentioned here, and also the idea of we bringing in a sort of coherent approach in India's development cooperation. It was right in 1954, India established what is called as India Aid Mission, and it was established in Kathmandu, because Kathmandu requested India for India was requested by Nepal, and Nepal requested for several projects like road construction, building of airport, water supply, radio tower, several things. And India was also just sort of rebuilding itself, and was trying to see how things can go forward for India. But we were doing it even at that stage with Nepal. We established our India Aid Mission in Nepal. So you can read and see there are several ways, but the story begins again in 2012 when India established what is called as Development Partnership Administration, DPA. So India's full development cooperation is established with what is called as DPA. It leads India's development assistance. So like Britain has DFID, US has USAID, Australia has AUSAID, India has what is called as DPA, Development Partnership Administration. So DPA delivers India's development cooperation to others. The policy making, etc., is done by the divisions which are there, but the delivery is ensured through DPA. And DPA has 3 different divisions. One division is for project implementation. The second looks after programs like ITEC. It is the capacity building. DPA 2, and DPA 3 is about several of our projects which are grant based, and DPA 1 actually looks after the LOCs, lines of credit that India gives. India is right now giving something like $5.67 billion to other countries every year, and we receive something like $5.87 billion from other countries. So it's almost what we are receiving from other countries that we are also giving to our partner countries from the south. This is broad dimension, but what is important here in this publication now is with all of you. This is a theoretical explanation that we have developed in RIS. We say that South-South cooperation is best explained by the idea of development compact, our partnership for development compact. So unlike North-South cooperation, which is more about grants and very small loan, ours is not like that. Ours is composition of several things. So modalities of engagement are not independent of each other. They are part of the same program, and these 5 modalities are what we see as part of the development compact. So development compact has capacity building, it has grants, it has concessional finance, it has technology, and it has trade. I just give you one quick example of why this idea we are saying is something that is combining. Mozambique approached India for rural electrification of villages in Mozambique, and there are some 240 villages in Mozambique which had to go for a rural electrification program. So India gave them example of India's own solar initiative that is there, and they found it very interesting. So India gave them a grant of $200 million to establish a solar panel production unit in outside Maputo and the capital city. And this required some sort of concessional finance, but it also required some form of grant. So it was combined with these two that India gave them the solar panel production unit. But then they came back and said, well, you have established the unit, your people are doing, but our scientists are not trained. So India then invited 25 scientists to be trained, because you have to place the battery at some point to get the connection with the grid. You have to install the cells. So we invited 25 scientists and shared the technology with them, and also provided training to those 25 scientists. So this is how the four elements were covered in the development compact in one project. Then they were very much worried that China is dumping solar panels all across. Mozambique would find a complete collapse if China is dumping. So then India sent some of the trade experts to Mozambique. Mozambique was not member of WTO in 2015 when this project was extended to them. Then we build up the capacity. In 2018, Mozambique has become member of the WTO, and this is how all the 5 units have worked. Another example I give you of Ethiopia. We have Ethiopia here. So, this Ethiopia, what we did was in 1962, Netherlands had provided sugar processing plants, 5 of them. Actually 10 were there. In the National Development Plan of 2012, Ethiopia identified sugar as a major sector for employment creation. So, and they identified India as a partner country for them. So they required better plants. When India started the exercise, we found that the quality of the sugarcane had also waned out in terms of productivity. So we gave a new germplasm for new sugarcane variety. Then a 600 million assistance was given for revival of the plants. Then the issue came up in terms of the rail connectivity to Djibouti. So China had already laid out the railway track, but India provided assistance to connect those factories with the railway track to Djibouti, which were part of the concessional finance and grants. The germplasm was part of the technology, and of course then the training was provided in terms of how those new machineries are to be run. The issue then came up in terms of the packaging, because Europe objected to the way sugar was being packaged. So there were specifications by Europe where all plastic packages were not allowed. So India then provided another $100 million for production of the jute bags, and the jute packaging was given to sugar production unit. Then the idea came up that duty-free, quota-free access should also be provided, and India was one of the first countries which implemented the 2005 declaration and call by the WTO at the Hong Kong WTO Ministerial for duty-free, quota-free access to all the LDCs, and India announced it in 2008. China also followed, but these two countries remained the only ones that followed the Hong Kong WTO Ministerial Declaration. This could complete the exercise that Ethiopia entered in with the sugarcane production unit. So this is what is there. Now each one, capacity building, there are certain indicators that are important for us to capture. So those of you who are interested and may like to write a paper on this, my colleagues would help you. There are other so also in RIS who can help you as to what this development compact is. So as I said, 5 modalities. Each of these modalities we have worked on, and in RIS we have tried to develop this model, how to quantify them. Because South-South cooperation is not just rhetoric, it is not just a political statement. It has theoretical basis, and it also has rigor of academic analysis. So it gives the, so those of you who are in academics, those of you who are in policy making, those of you who are from Ministry of Foreign Affairs of your respective governments, it would be interesting for you to note that South-South cooperation is not rhetoric, it has theoretical basis, and it can also be empirically captured. So what are the indicators to capture statistics on capacity building? And this is something that we have done for India. We have developed a huge database in RIS on India's development assistance from 47 till 2018, and that dimension is covering some of the indicators. Today I don't have time to get into these details, but I just wanted to leave this idea with you. Those of you who are interested can pursue with me later, and we can give you. So on capacity building, on trade, on technology, on concessional finance, and also on grants. All these 5 modalities, what parameters are they, what indicators are there that we can use, gives you the idea. Then of course technology and knowledge sharing, as I said, is one of the important dimensions. Both Dr. Ravi and Ambassador Bhaskar Balakrishnan would give you many more examples. There is an excellent book by Dr. Balakrishnan on science diplomacy. You would be getting a grant to buy some books. Please start making a list of the books that you want, and within that money, they would be free of cost for you. So that program provides for it, and our colleagues, both Amit and Nimita, would work with you for books up to, I think, 5,000 rupees or something you can buy from under this course. So you can make a list of that. Technology and knowledge, South-South cooperation. As I said, the crux of the idea of South-South cooperation is to reduce dependence on any other country, become self-reliant. You don't have to depend on the United States, you don't have to depend on China, India, anybody, no, nobody. The idea of South-South cooperation is to enable countries to be dependent on themselves, and this I think is absolutely essential for any science diplomacy program on what self-reliance is, what domestic capacity building is, and this is without conditionality. So it is at the same level, it is not top down, it is not giving knowledge to somebody, it is also a sort of contributing back. And this is the idea when under this course we compel each one of you to write is your contribution to this course. And this is not that we lecture you, but you also lecture us. You also give back knowledge to us that you have. And that's why we request each one of you to write. Do we have any science diplomacy book of the previous course? So, which book you have given?
We have not.
No, previous course book.
We have given.
So that idea of, Amit, can you get the book of science? So that I think would be important for us to understand that this is not one-way process. It is two-way process. And we want each one of you also to learn from each other. It is not about India alone. It is about the whole group, all of us learning from each other and exchanging our experiences, our knowledge, our idea of development with each other, so that we are benefited. We have excellent knowledge to learn from what Argentina is doing, how they are doing it, how Nigeria is doing it, how Mongolia is trying to cope up with the dimensions that are there of economic development challenges, and each country has a different set of challenges. They have different opportunities and they